in plain sight. It's interesting.
Right.
And then even in the same verse 3 here, where we see to work vengeance on the spirits of deceit and of Beliar. That's a name we're familiar with, right, Sean?
Yes. Yeah. So we've got both the spirits of deceit. I mean, I don't know what you guys think, but I would think that's the unclean spirits.
Yeah, that's what I would think.
Sure.
And then and then Beliar, of course, is a reference, to the enemy, the evil one, Satan.
Sure. Yeah.
Which I think means wicked one. I think Beliar means wicked one, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
And this is a concept that the reason why they would be mentioned together is because, as we read in Enoch, in Jubilees as well, they subjected themselves to his authority to be used to be working wickedness among the sons of men.
Yeah.
And so we actually see this concept to me, and this is when I was studying this kind of popped out to me was in Enoch 54, in the first 6 verses, it talks about these spirits that subjected themselves to Satan and how they would be judged on the day of the Lord, and the angels would round them up basically, so that there's no more unclean spirits trying to tempt mankind. It's basically also, from what I can understand, it's referred to in Isaiah 24, verses 17 through 23, and I'll just go there real quick and read a couple passages from it for the viewer to get a little bit of an understanding. Because, we see these unclean spirits all throughout the Gospels, but we don't get a lot of explanation on where they came from in the Old Testament.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's a lot of debate on that, but I think that's only because books like Enoch were removed.
Mm-hmm.
And Jubilees was never put in the American canon. If we had those 2 books in the Bible, like if we basically had the Ethiopian Bible in our possession this whole time, we would have never had a debate on where these unclean spirits came from.
Yeah, totally. I agree.
It would have been easy to understand why Yeshua was interacting with them everywhere he went, Yeah. But here in Isaiah 24, verse 17 through 23, it says, "Terror and pit and snare confront you, O inhabitant of the earth. And then it will be that he who flees the report of disaster will fall into the pit, and he who climbs out of the pit will be caught in the snare. For the windows above are opened, and the foundations of the earth shake. The earth is broken asunder, and the earth is split through. The earth is shaken violently. The earth reels to and fro like a drunkard, and it totters like a shack. For its transgression is heavy upon it, and it will fall never to rise. So it will happen in that day. The Lord will punish the host of heaven on high and the kings of the earth on the earth, and they will be gathered together like prisoners in the dungeon and will be confined in prison. And after many days they will be punished. For the moon will be abashed and the sun ashamed, for the Lord of hosts will reign on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and his glory will be before his elders." So if you actually look here in verse 21 of Isaiah 24:21, and we'll go into the Hebrew of this passage, it's pretty fascinating because most translations will just talk about, who will punish the hosts of the heavens or the powers of the heavens, and also the kings of the earth on the earth below. Which to me, that delineates 2 different groups, right? The hosts of the heaven, and then also, well, what have we just been talking about? The firmament is the word heaven, but if you look in the Hebrew, it says the exalted ones. So it's kind of a poor translation in most of these translations where it says the hosts of heaven on high, and it's actually the Strong's word 4791, which once you look on that, and I'll put this up here on the screen for the viewer as well, and it's just talking about those on high, or the exalted ones, those who are haughty in exalted places. So to me, this is a callback to the idea of Ephesians 6, right? We battle not against flesh and blood, but spirits of the air and wickedness in high places.
Yeah.
And this is a concept that I think the writers of the epistles, not just the epistles, but all the prophets understood this idea of unclean spirits were the spirits of the air. And how that works, I can't give you a definitive idea. I just know that, like in Daniel, we see an angel physically being opposed by the prince of Persia, and we know angels come from above, right?
Yeah.
So they're coming down through the air to try to get to the ground. And I'm not trying to go into the whole alien phenomenon, even though I personally believe that the whole alien concept are just unclean spirits masquerading as something else. But that kind of goes into some science and technology concepts involved. But the whole general premise of what is this spirits of wickedness in the air, right? These principalities. And I think it's Isaiah 24 where here it's talking about these these exalted ones, these ones that are haughty and exalted, and they're the host of the heaven. Now, of course, we say that the word heaven is often referred to as, just like in Genesis chapter 1, verse 19, where it talks about the birds flow across the open heaven, the open firmament, which is basically the air where the birds fly, right? Yep. So there's context to these ideas. And to me, if we got a delineation between the day of the Lord, Yeshua's return with his angels, of course he's going to encounter the spirits of of wickedness in high places first, before he gets to the ground to take care of the kings of the earth on the ground, right? Just naturally, because he's coming from top down. So this is kind of where I'm leading in that thought process of why the Testament of 12 Patriarchs, the book of Levi here, would be talking about both the spirits of deceit and Beliar vengeance is being worked on them on this day of judgment. Because that's what we see happening in prophecy on the day of the Lord when Yeshua returns. And of course, once they get to the ground, then we got Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3, where Michael is grabbing Beliar, Satan, and wrapping him in the great chain to actually put him in the pit for 1,000 years.
So it's almost like there's like a two-stage kind of military campaign going on in the day of the Lord, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's always fascinated me. I don't know about you, Matthew, but it's fascinated me where Sean was mentioning in Daniel, Gabriel having to come down and have a wrestling match with the Prince of Persia, and withstanding, I guess, for like 21 days apparently, and he had to call on Michael, the chief. I guess he's referred to as the chief, right? The captain, the stronger one, who had to come and kind of deal with it. But it's just interesting because it shows that even angels, they're not all the same, right? I mean, there's a ranking system just like we would have on the earth. And I've always wondered what the heck Gabriel was wrestling with, right? Was he wrestling with another angel? Is it an unclean spirit, a demon? What's going on here, right? And
I don't think it was a human prince.
No.
That's right. Some commentators say that it was, but I don't think it was. Just a little bit of humor here. I met a guy back in the 90s, the late 90s, that wouldn't listen to the radio because it was called the airwaves, and the prince of the power of the air and all this kind of stuff. So just keeping it lighthearted. I thought about that when Sean was explaining, which I agreed, Sean, with what you said about the host of heaven. I liked how you put all that. I thought that was very well. But that guy came into my mind, and I was like, man, that was before really the internet took off. But
was he also afraid of flying on airplanes?
I don't remember. This guy, if you knew this guy, he probably never flew in an airplane, more than likely. But I've met some characters, put it that way.
He's just being precautionary, right?
Yeah.
And is this something that, let's take a quick look at this, right? It calls them the spirits of deceit here in verse 3. Now, what we've been doing all of our research on, the difference between something that was born on earth, which is called earthy in 1 Corinthians 15, or something that's born as a spiritual nature, which is different, right?
Yeah.
And we know these angels are of a spiritual nature, and that's why they're called spirit beings, right? Ministering spirits, as Hebrew 1:14 calls them.
Right.
But yet we're made of earth. So is this what Enoch was talking about? And was it Enoch chapter 9 or 10 where it's talking about these spirits, these unclean spirits that were birthed as a result of these rebellious angels taking wives? So if angels were spiritual beings, they're made of somehow a different physics, if you will, but yet they according to Jubilees 15:27, they actually have male parts. So it made sense that they could take wives and procreate because they had the ability to do so. So then they have these unclean spirits are birthed, as we see as a result in Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4, that are called the Nephilim, and they're referred to as unclean spirits. Yet they're still tangible, right? Just like an angel, you can grab an angel and you can wrestle with an angel, right? Like Jacob did, and hold on to it. Or an angel can show up and open the gates and Peter can get out of prison. You know what I'm saying? So like, is it possible that these Nephilim interacted with mankind, but were literally of a different nature? And this is why the Father has to say in the book of Enoch, they were born on the earth. They're never going to go to the heaven, right? That they were made on the earth. They're going to stay on the earth. But is it maybe, I mean, this is some speculation we did, I think, in episode 2 of the first season, reviewing the book of Enoch. But Ken, is it possible this whole time, like the enemies or Satan's plan, if you will, was if I can get some spirit beings of my own that are subjected to my will, then I can actually make war with the spirit beings above.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
You can't, like your earthly beings, if you just get mankind to rebel, that's good for something, but it's not going to help you against angels. So you got to get. Yeah,
no, man, I agree. And I just pulling up Revelation 12, verses 7 to 9, where it says, "And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon." The dragon obviously being a reference to Satan or Beliar. "The dragon and his angels waged war," or the word there, they put angels, but it can just be messengers. "And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in the heavens." So it's, yeah, they weren't strong enough, but they were obviously able to fight in some capacity, right? Whereas that isn't even possible if Satan was to amass a human army of some sort, because we know one angel in particular, Ramael, was able to kill 185,000 Assyrians in night without even, flinching. So yeah, I agree, man. He had to somehow create an army that's comparable to his own spiritual anatomy, if you will, right?
Yeah, at least that's the way it's reading to me. I mean, for the viewer, go ahead and tell us in the comments what you think if you have any other information on that. But that would make a lot of sense if he's trying to make a comparable army, and therefore he's just like, well, I'll just birth them. It reminds me of Lord of the Rings, right?
I was going to say the Uruk-hai. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
What did Mr. Tolkien know, guys? What did he know?
I don't know if this has gotten brought up or not, but this is maybe a simple point. But sometimes when people read what they call extra biblical books and they see concepts or words that are strange to their ear, they automatically discredit those books because of a weird concept. They forget about, like the Bible that they're accustomed to. They forget about where, a great sea parted and people walked on dry land, or a donkey talked, or things like that. But right here in, I think it was verse 3, where it mentions Beliar or Belial, which are basically two forms of the same word. I just wanted to bring up that the beloved Apostle Paul, the people that a lot of people read a lot in the New Testament, mentions this in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where he's talking about there needs to be no fellowship with righteousness and unrighteousness. And he says something to the effect of, what communion hath Christ or the Messiah with Belial? Or some Bibles actually read Beliar. And so Christ is a person, the Messiah, and so is Belial. And it's a reference to a name of Satan. And so if you think that concept might sound strange in the Testament of Levi, your beloved Apostle Paul also mentioned Satan by that name as well. Yeah. I just thought that might be good to bring up.
That's right, brother. Good catch.
Absolutely.
Good catch. Yeah.
He's not just making up nicknames, in a void, right?
Yeah.
He's referring back to some sort of knowledge that already existed. So I agree, brother Matthew. Yeah.
Sure.
What's interesting is one of the things that Sean and I have encountered with regards to the book of Enoch, where they have objections over it, is First Enoch 40 verse 9, where it says that this angel named Phanuel, he watches over the repentance and the hope of those who will inherit eternal life, acting like a priest in a way. And they're like, well, no, he's taken away, Jesus's role as our high priest, and so therefore this is a corrupted book. It can't be. It's misleading. But as we've just read in chapter 3, starting in verses 5 and then finishing out, we get to see some interesting characteristics regarding angels and what they're doing up there and how they're acting. And what do you think about that, guys?
Well, I think that the law is kept in heaven just like it is on earth. So, and Moses was told in Exodus 25, 26, and 27 to pattern the things he was making for the earthly tabernacle after what he saw in the heavenly tabernacle. And we have Paul explain this. Well, I believe Paul wrote Hebrews, but we have Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 through 5 also expound on this idea. about how Moses patterned the earthly tabernacle after the heavenly one. We know there's a heavenly sanctuary in heaven that is called the Father's sanctuary. It's promised to come down to us in Ezekiel 37. The law is kept in heaven. It is the Father's behavior, his ways. We know from Isaiah 57, I think it's verse 6, that sacrifices are persisting in the millennial reign. We also know this from Ezekiel 44, verse 9, which is part of the law. And I think that this mention right here in verse 5 of offering to the Lord, these archangels who are ministering, making propitiation for all the sins of ignorance of the righteous, offering a sweet-smelling savor, reasonable and bloodless offering. And this is a direct reference to Leviticus chapter 1 through 7, about all the different instructions for sacrifices, all had to be without blood. And the burnt offering specifically in Leviticus chapter 1, where, as the smoke ascended from the burnt offering, it was considered a sweet-smelling savor. We see this call back to Genesis 9 and Noah doing a burnt offering when they got off the boat in Genesis 9. Mm-hmm. So this concept of angels themselves being able to minister, make propitiation for all the sins of ignorance and of the righteous. Well, if there's a tabernacle in heaven and the law is kept in heaven, then you need priests to minister that law in that tabernacle. It's all component pieces. It's all the same. So if angels are to be a set apart holy ones, that was the description given to Aaron to be for his people, is a set apart holy minister of the Lord. And angels are already called ministers of God anyway, right? That's their initial created purpose. So from my understanding, it seems like these guys were the first priesthood.
That's how I understand it, man. Yeah.
Likewise. What do you guys see as the bloodless offering here? Do you see it like as just the angels making some type of a prayer or propitiation to Yahweh? Is that the bloodless offering being referenced here? How do y'all understand that?
Well, yeah, it seems like they're making, apart from taking an animal and sacrificing it, they're doing all the ones that I think didn't require that. And because they wouldn't need to, right? I mean, they're eternal, essentially. Enoch tells us that they were created eternal. And so, in my opinion, and Sean can obviously give us his opinion on it, there's no need for them to do blood-related sacrifices, in my opinion.
Okay.
Well, this will be a rare episode where I disagree with Ken.
and I'm sure I'll change my mind because I haven't actually studied this particular passage further out with regards to how that would work. But I know there's going to be blood sacrifices going on in the millennial reign, like just as it was instructed in Leviticus.
Sure.
Here's the understanding that I have, and you guys, catch me if you think this sounds off, but there's many sacrifices instructed in Leviticus and Numbers, a part of God's law. And many of them do have to do with animals, wherein there's blood. But even in those sacrifices that pertain to animals, you are to drain the blood and then put the meat upon the altar after you've cut the fat off. It depends on the sacrifice. It depends on the circumstance of the sacrifice. But if we go to to Leviticus 4, that would be, in my opinion, the contextual reference of what we're reading in this passage in the book of Levi, where it's talking about these angels are ministering propitiation for the sins of ignorance. And this is what Leviticus 4 and 5, well, mostly 4, is all about. This is part of the law. So we're watching Levi tell us angels are doing the law of Leviticus chapter 4 in the heavenly tabernacle above. And this is for sins of ignorance, people that do sins unintentionally, not knowing. And we already got a reference to this. I think it was in the end of chapter. Was it the end of chapter 2, where it says, the sons of man don't realize this, and therefore they sin and provoke the Most High. The end of chapter 3. But the sons of men, having no perception of these things, sin and provoke the Most High. So these are sins of ignorance.
Yeah,
and that's what's being referenced here, in my opinion, in the following point here that's what's being referenced earlier in this chapter 3, where these angels are making propitiation and ministering because they are in a tabernacle. We already see angels doing heavenly priestly duties anyway in the book of Revelation, right? So it's not a
so do you see concept. Are you saying are you saying that the bloodless offering here in chapter 3 verse 5 of Levi, do you think that that's an animal sacrifice, or is that something like
yes, the bloodless offering?
Okay.
in Leviticus 4 is also a bloodless offering, because remember, you have to. This is where, to me, you would keep things in the context of what's the process being laid out for these things, right? So, like in Leviticus 4:5, the anointed priest is to take some of the blood of the bull and bring it to the tent of meeting. He's to dip his finger in and do certain things with it, right? That's specifically for if a priest, the anointed priest, commits a sin of unintentional sin, right? A sin of ignorance. But then if you go down to the whole congregation, right? If there's the whole verse 13 through 21 of Leviticus 4, if the whole congregation of Israel commits error and the matter escapes the notice of the assembly, they commit any of the things which the Lord has commanded them not to be done, and they become guilty, then they have to come in. The anointed priest will take some of the blood of the bull to the tent of meeting. The priest will dip his finger in the blood, sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the veil. So this is where people say, well, look, but there's blood being used. But if we remember back earlier in chapters 1, there's a mention of no blood can be on his actual altar. So like,
you're right.
actually have to drain the animal of the blood before you actually put the pieces of the animal up on the altar for the sacrifice and the burnt offering. And then this is why the instructions in this passage of Leviticus 4 for unintentional sin, or i.e. a sin of ignorance, is you burn it completely and make atonement for them. And they're not eating this offering here.
Okay.
Does it make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I follow what you're saying. I'm not sure whether I agree or disagree. I do follow what you're saying, and it makes sense. At the end of Leviticus 5, it does talk about how that someone that can't afford the animal could eventually just bring, I think it mentions olive oil, frankincense, I'm reading here. And there were offerings, like there was, I think, 5 categories of offerings in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus. And one of them was the grain offering, which was, I mean, all the way bloodless. You know, there was no animal involved at all. And so I was just curious. I didn't know, when I first read this, I was thinking maybe the bloodless offering was just a reference to like the prayers or the petitions of the angels to the Most High. But I follow what you're saying too. You know, it could be.
And like I said, if you guys catch something I missed, please let me know. I agree. There's different offerings that are explained in those first 7 chapters of Leviticus. To me, the meat of chapter 4 goes over 3 different types of sins of ignorance offerings.
Okay.
And those, they're a burnt offering, and Leviticus 1, as it explains the burnt offering, gives us that context that you have to drain all the blood out of it before you burn it on the altar. And so, you know, this is where this concept runs heavy against the teaching of dispensation theology, which would say that none of this stuff is done before Moses and none of this stuff is done after Jesus, and definitely none of this stuff is done in heaven. That's never claim that, right? This is a concept that, to me, if you read messianic, millennial reign prophecies, and you read really the nuts and bolts of what the law is, being something that it's his behavior he does in his house and his sanctuary that he should mankind to practice on the earth, then you realize he's already doing this stuff up there. And if Jesus is our high priest who ministers, Hebrews 4:14, at the right hand of the Father in heaven, in the heavenly sanctuary, well, he's doing something. He's not just standing there looking at him. Like, he's doing the law,
Yeah,
So,
I agree. I see your point too on the sins of ignorance mentioned in chapter 4. I see that correlation because, all of the offerings, a misconception Christians have is that all of the animal sacrifices, they think that they were all for sin.
right.
And that's not the case. That's just not the case. There were some sacrifices that weren't offered for sin. They were offered just for thankfulness, like Yahweh blessed you and you wanted to bless him back, and you give your prize bull or your prize goat. It has nothing to do necessarily with the sin, whether intentional or unintentional. So
like offering.
Yeah, what now?
Or like a offering of a vow.
Yeah, or a vow offering, or a fellowship, peace or fellowship offering, something like that. So in this particular thing, kind of segueing into something else in verse 5, it mentions the sins of ignorance of the righteous.
That's right.
And so, I think Torah observant people like us or others, we tend to forget that righteous people have sins.
That's right.
What is it? I think it's Proverbs 24. says a just man or a righteous man falls 7 times but gets back up, but the wicked falleth into ruin and are destroyed. So when I read that this morning, and my mind went to the Psalm. I think it's in Psalm maybe 19, somewhere around in there, where David said, reveal to me or forgive me of my hidden faults. I think the King James Version uses secret faults.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the next verse, he contrasts that with presumptuous and willful sins. And so David recognized, which I consider David to be one of the most righteous men in the whole scriptures, not perfect, but he was very righteous. And he recognized, as he prayed to Yahweh, forgive me of my hidden faults. I know there's things I'm not aware of. And I think these are things that happen on a daily basis. We live our lives. We transgress the Torah. We're not aware of it. If we were, we would, get on our knees or ask the Father to forgive us. So I think that's why we are supposed to pray every day. Forgive us of our transgressions as we forgive those who transgress against us. But I thought this morning, it calls them sins. So we can't dismiss them and say, well, they're not important just because they're hidden. They're not important. It still refers to them as sins. But at the same time, it shows here that the angels they're carrying along the mercies of Yahweh. They're making these bloodless sacrifices that forgives the sins of ignorance that the righteous Torah observant people make, the sins that they do. And I thought that corresponded. I thought it harmonized with the scriptures really, really well, in that righteous people sin. When you read about the righteous person, it doesn't mean that they're sinless. It does mean that their life is characterized by obedience, but it doesn't mean that they're perfect,
Yeah, and that whole concept requires the initial point of faith. Like, they believe God exists, so therefore they start to become obedient, right? And to me, I love what you said, Matthew, and I love what this thing here in the book of Levi is pointing out, because to me, it's just super merciful. It shows the Father knows, right? Thoughts and intents of the heart. He knows those who are righteous are those who are actually putting faith and trust in him to actually try to be obedient, which is why it's, in my opinion, why it's called practicing righteousness in the scripture.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here, and to me, this is a great callback to something I actually read a little bit ago from Job 22, verse 30. He will deliver one who is not innocent, and he will be delivered through the cleanness of your hands. So to me, this is a messianic prophecy of, like you just said, even the righteous will be delivered, even though they're not innocent, right? That's why, no one can save himself. We must rely on Yeshua through his perfect obedience. He can save us through the cleanness of his hands. He can
completely agree.
Atonement for us and make eternal propitiation for us and raise us unto eternal life. I mean, that is, so yeah, absolutely, man, absolutely. But how beautiful is it that the Father put in place over Israel and over all who would believe and obey, right? Is this idea that these angels themselves would be tasked to minister in regards to mankind. And actually, we saw this conversation in the book of Enoch, didn't we, Ken?
Yes, we did. Yep.
Where Enoch is being kind of chastised by God, where he's like, "What are you doing, coming to make what does he say?
Supplication for angels when they should be doing it for you."
Yeah, he's like, "You're interceding for angels, and they need to be interceding for you." Like, it's
yeah, it's wild. One of the things that stuck out to me in that same verse, where it just mentions the word sins, the sins of ignorance of the righteous, right? And so once again, we see this word pre-Mount Sinai, and we even see it in Genesis. I mean, it's used a few times, right? Cain, be careful lest sin be crouching at your door type thing, right? And we know if we use the scriptures to define itself and give us the definitions of the terms, 1 John 3:4, sin is transgression of the law. And so it just makes sense that the Father always had a law of some sort to give to mankind so that they know what righteousness is and what, lawlessness is. And so it's very fascinating to me.
And this is a wonderful example of the law being followed in heaven.
Yeah.
I mean,
now, Sean, just an addendum real quick, brother. Where it says that the archangels who minister and make propitiation to Yahweh, that reminded me of Revelation 15, verses 6 to 7, where it says, "Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen and wore golden sashes around their chests." So we even see even their garb is the same as it was instructed for the priest to wear, right? This, like the linen clothing and all that stuff. We're going to be given linen breeches and robes and stuff of righteousness at the resurrection, because we're going to be resurrected into a priesthood, a holy, righteous priesthood. I just find that really fascinating. So we got these 7 angels. I think they're probably the same ones that we're seeing here in verse 5 of chapter 3 of Levi. And it's the same lot, in my opinion, found in 1 Enoch 20. We have 7 angels there, and they're the ones that are watching over, the deeds of mankind, essentially. And
so let's just, and this, I joked with my wife behind the scenes that this particular episode is that just the general believer is not ready for it. Like this particular episode is going to challenge a lot of folks. And if you're still with us watching this one, thank you, because we know that this is running against a lot of other teaching out there from the traditional church that is heavy in dispensation theology, that is heavy in Trinitarianism, and none of it helps people understand the priesthood. None of it understands the role of priests. None of it teaches or explains the concept of a sanctuary in heaven, the law being kept in heaven by God. So I know that we're talking about some topics that may be initially eyebrow raising to you, but stick with us, because we're trying to show you this from the canon itself. This has always been there this whole time. Like, this is the way the Father does and how he works through his law to create salvation for mankind. And this is, to me, is a super important idea to understand in the context of Scripture as a whole, which is why my context tree in my channel includes the priesthoods, right? Well, one of those priesthoods is the angelic priesthood. And this is why Yeshua tells us we're going to be made like the angels at the resurrection, and why we're promised in Exodus 19:5 and 1 Peter 2:5 and a whole bunch of other places that we are a royal priesthood. In our as a part of our promise to us. So I think it's interesting to me that we have this, like you're talking about, these 7 archangels that are doing these priestly duties. They're dressed in priestly garments, as we see Aaron was, and as we're promised at the resurrection. And they're ministering to the Lord just as we're promised to be made ministers unto the Lord. But basically what I was joking with my wife was that, I'm not sure that a lot of people, there's so many fundamental ideas in this conversation we're having right now that a lot of people may struggle with this greatly, right? And we want you to prayerfully consider the scriptures we're putting on screen and to test what we're reviewing for you, and take some time with this, chew on it, marinate on it, study the scriptures on this, because God's priesthood is intricate all throughout the story. It's literally what you as a believer are going to be promised to become. And that means a priest keeps the law of God. That's the whole point of that job. So even as a regular believer, we're admonished to keep the law of God. But the promise of your resurrection means you're going to become a priest who faithfully and without fail will minister and keep the law of God in the New Jerusalem, in his house. So I feel like it's very important for people to understand what's promised to them and why these references can be made about our angelic brethren who on day one were already made in this capacity, and why it's such a big deal when 200 of these angels, including Satan, rebelled in the days of Enoch, because that was the first, in a sense, it's like the first priesthood was starting to fail, and that's a big deal.
Yeah, Sean, and it's funny because when we read over the apocalypse of Abraham, I believe Abraham was told by the angel Jael, when Azazel, which is another name for Satan, essentially rebelled, he disrobed himself of his priestly garments, essentially, and he says, now you're gonna take his garments in the process. So because of his rebellion, you guys are going to be kind of resurrected into this priesthood, right? You're going to take over where it's lacking, and I find that super interesting.
Let me add this too, and I'm almost for certain that both of you brothers will agree. But somebody might get the idea that because we're talking about the Levitical or Aaronic priesthood, or we're talking about the angelic priesthood, and somebody might think, well, why don't they talk about Jesus? Why don't they talk about Yeshua? And we all agree that when it comes to priesthoods or high priest, Yeshua is at the top.
That's right.
He's he's number one. You know, he's actually second in command over the entire universe. So I mean, he has the greatest esteemed position. And so we're not taking away from anything that Yeshua has done and accomplished for us on our behalf through his perfect life and his glorious priesthood right now in the heavens next to Yahweh. We're not taking away from any of that. We're just acknowledging, hey, there are reasons these other priesthoods were established and were set up on the earth with Levi and even in the heavens prior to that with the angels. And so just thought I'd throw that out there just so if anybody is scared and wants to change the channel, you know, we all acknowledge Yeshua and what he did for us in his priesthood, and he's glorious and he's great, and without him we couldn't have salvation, and so forth and so on.
And Matthew, just to add quickly what you're saying, now that we've got this perspective of understanding that angels, as we read in Revelation 15, Revelation, what is it? Also chapter 5, this concept of angels possibly doing priestly duties in the heavenly tabernacle. How fitting now is the book of Hebrews chapter 1 when it begins and starts off explaining Yeshua has inherited a greater authority position than even the angels, right?
Yes.
Which, that, you know, if we understand the priesthood in general, was that Aaron, for example, in the book of Exodus, when Aaron's given the high priesthood, he was made as a ruler over everybody else. He was only second to Moses.
Yes.
That same authority structure is analogous and comparable in this same concept, which is why, like in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, and it says, and he, Yeshua, is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of the Father's nature, and upholds all things by the word of his power. And when he had made purification of sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much better than the angels, as he has inherited a more excellent name than they. For which of the angels did he ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? And again, I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. And when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, and let all the angels of God worship him.
Yes.
So the angels are already under Yeshua's authority, right? Yeah. Which is why if we're made like the angels, and as Paul says, you know, in 1 Corinthians 6, we'll be judging angels.
Yeah.
That means
yes.
we inherit puts us in authority over them at the resurrection, which is fascinating because this whole time they've been praying for our salvation. Hebrews 1:14 says their ministering spirits sent out to help those who are inheriting salvation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like their whole servitude and their obedience is so that we can then be resurrected to be put in a place of authority over them.
Yeah, it's wild. Yeah,
like,
it is wild.
That's wild, man.
in making the comparison, anytime the Hebrews author makes a comparison and says Yeshua is greater and he's better, he's not saying that which is lesser is worthless.
Yeah.
Right.
In order for the comparison to be valid, you have to compare with something that is of worth, that means a lot to people. And so for him to say, look, the Levites did this, but Yeshua is greater, it doesn't mean fully on the Levites. It just means theirs is less than what Yeshua's is. When all of my children were real small, I used to tell them that I liked chocolate ice cream, but Dad likes vanilla better. So if Mom goes to the store and she says, which would you prefer? I would say, well, get vanilla. Chocolate is good, but vanilla is better. Me saying vanilla is better to me doesn't mean I don't like chocolate. If she brings home chocolate, I'm going to eat the chocolate. Okay. But vanilla is better. So that was a way for my children to understand comparisons in scripture doesn't mean bad and good all the time. It can mean good and greater or good and better. So
Matthew, we all know that chocolate's better than vanilla. Come on, brother. Let's be real. No, but
I'm in the minority. I'm in the minority.
No, I agree with both you brothers for sure. It is important to touch base on Yeshua and being the high priest of the order of Melchizedek. I mean, he was foreordained from the foundations of the world to be raised into that priesthood, right? That's his role that was always promised to him, which is so, overlooked in Christendom. So I think that's one of the things we want to definitely reiterate in this episode is that Yeshua definitely is, as you guys have beautifully said, he is, when it comes to hierarchy, he's above the angels. So we're not saying that they're in any capacity better than him or that they usurp his priesthood in any way? Not at all. We're just trying to bring context to what we're reading here, right?
That's right. The next verse where it talks about the angels who bear answers to the angels of the presence of the Lord. Do you guys think that that's the moment there? I'm not sure on this one. Do you guys think that this is the moment there where in Revelation 20, verse 11 through 13, all the deeds of men are recorded?
Yeah, it could be in those books. Yeah.
Is that the answers that they're bearing in some regard? I don't know.
Well, the angels below, if I recall, they're the ones that operate in accordance with the angels above, right? They have to like answer to them and give them whatever they've recorded or whatever they've spotted. Do you recall what I'm talking about, Sean?
Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
So I don't know what exactly that's pertaining to, but it just goes to the hierarchy, right, within the firmaments and wherever they're placed and what they're doing. So
yeah, it seems to be the higher up in the firmament you are, the more authority you have, right?
Yeah.
Hence the Most High.
Yeah.
So I don't really have a comment on verse 7. I don't know. I mean, that's something I'd have to look at.
Well, and this is where I wish we had a concordance to look at some of the translated words, because when I see this concept of bearing something in the scriptures, like Leviticus 17:10 or Isaiah 53, I think it's verse 12, where it talks about bearing, it's usually referred to a priestly concept where like they're bearing the iniquity of people through the process of mediating the law for atonement. And I don't know if that's what it's referring to, considering verse 6, or if it's just simply the concept of them angels being like scribes, recording the deeds of men, both good and bad, so they can be presented for judgment.
Yeah. One interesting to note is that these angels in verse 7 are made of complete spirit. They don't have bodies, apparently. I remember that detail in the Apocalypse of Abraham. So
that's right. Yeah.
It's interesting.
But and then of course it talks about the heaven next to it, or thrones and dominions, always offering their praise to God, which is, who are these guys? What's going on there?
Yeah. Paul mentions them, doesn't he?
What's that?
Doesn't Paul mention like dominions and thrones and powers and all that?
Yeah. Which verse is that though? I don't remember that.
Is that Ephesians 6?
Paul mentions that in Colossians 1. I don't know if it's the same context, but in Colossians 1, where he talks about, for by him was all things created, whether they be thrones, dominions, principalities, or powers.
Right, yeah.
I think the Ephesians 6 context is in the bad context.
That's right, yeah.
But I think I think that might be.
Yeah, the Colossians reference is correct, Matthew. Yeah, you're right.
Wow, this is crazy. But yeah, verse 10 is pretty accurate. I mean, because this is what we see all around us, right? The sons of men, we don't have any perception of these things going on in the heavenly realm. And therefore, we provoke the Most High. And all these things are happening while we're running around, watching Netflix and, defrauding our neighbor and doing adultery and lying to people. And, you know what I'm saying? All this is happening while the sons of men on the earth are just running around in lawlessness and doing their own thing. No one knows.
Yeah, it's amazing. Who was it? That reminds me. Who was it? Was it the prophet? I think it might have been the prophet Elisha, where there was an account where this guy, his eyes were open to be able to see all of the angels that were around there that would fight for him on his behalf or something like that. I can't remember. It's been a while since I read that.
Kings chapter 6, brother.
Yeah. Okay. All right. There we go. We got a concordance with you, man.
He's the Sean Encyclopedia, man.
So I guess my point bringing that up is this: if our eyes could be opened to see the spirit realm in its fullness or in its totality, or at least maybe 50%, it seems like it would help matters along here. But whether or not we can see it or not, we've got to be obedient to the Creator. But yeah, verse 10, it rings true, because people do everything under the sun, because not only do they not acknowledge Yahweh, but they can't see all of these things that we're reading about, can't see all of these things going on, which would probably help there be more fear of Yahweh in people.
I wonder if the servant that had his eyes open to see these angelic forces or whatever, or the ones that are in this particular firmament of heaven, the ones that are made of complete spirit, where you have to have like a spirit, like your eyes open to see them type thing. Whereas we know that the other angels that are above them can put on the appearance of men and walk and be handled and all that stuff, and you don't have to be in the spirit to see them. You know what I mean? Interesting.
This has been a fascinating episode here on Honor of Kings. We've been going over the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, the Book of Levi specifically, and just trying to get through the beginning chapters of these gentlemen has been so fun. There's so many scriptural parallels that we see here, and also just insights that this particular book that was included in other canons, that was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, is commenting on things that we just see hintings at in the canon of 66, and given an incredible amount of exposition and clarity to some of these ideas. And guys, I don't know what y'all think, but I think it's fascinating. And I think this has been a lot of fun reviewing this, and I'm super excited to continue going through the rest of this book. What do you think, Ken?
I concur, brother. Yeah, absolutely. This book is it's an eye-opener. It definitely adds a lot more context where I've had questions regarding some of the concepts that we've talked about, and I look forward to the coming chapters. And Brother Matthew, I think it's been awesome that you've been able to join us, and we definitely want you back, brother.
Thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. We appreciate everybody for watching, and just continue to support these brothers and what they're doing. I think they're doing a great work, and I've enjoyed being a part. And I will be back. You always will, and we shall live. I'll be back to finish out this Testament of Levi. I'm looking forward to getting into the remaining portion. So thank you, brother, so much.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks for being here with us, man. We look forward to seeing you next time. And for the viewer, thanks for joining us again. Please come back and see us next week as we continue going through this fascinating and intriguing book of the Book of Levi from the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. This has been Honor of Kings. We'll see you next time.